Asian America. I was born in your area. I don't belong in your area, but you gon' let my sister marry ya. Yeah, Asian America. Oh, I'm so invincible. I'm so invisible. Yeah. Student, but never the principal. Yeah, Asian America. Don't I fit into your narrative? BB cream bleach on my melanin. Ain't my skin whiter than hey, big eyes like an
Welcome to CAP's first assembly here at Hale. My name is Krista Chan and my pronouns are she, her, and I am president of CAPS, or also known as the Coalition of Asian and Pacific Students. Before I start, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that this virtual assembly is being held on the traditional lands of the Duwamish people. Acknowledgement grounds us in the reality of ongoing colonization and helps us better understand our past, present, and future. But it's really important that we go beyond just acknowledgement to action, to repaying stolen settler capital to indigenous folks to help them achieve liberation and sovereignty. In the Seattle area, the Duwamish tribe has set up a program called, as shown, Real Rent Duwamish, where you can pay rent to the Duwamish tribe if you are able. Oftentimes, our classroom curriculum comes from a white male cis perspective, a blemished, sugarcoat version of history, leaving students of color not knowing our heritage and sets white students ignorant to history of oppression that is shown today. Productive conversations are hard to come around when talking about issues that affect our students of color, making Black, Indigenous, and people of color feel unwelcomed in our schools due to lack of proper knowledge base. If we only have one story, one perspective in the classroom, it creates a single story, and that is not education. We need to be providing mirrors for our students, a mirror that allows them to reflect on themselves and their identity. However, these mirrors must not be tainted or twisted, but reflecting in multiple situations and positive outlooks. This year's theme for our assembly is Our Voices, Our Stories, Resilience, Surviving, Thriving. May is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and this year is especially important that we listen with the anti-Asian hate crimes that have been very much alive in our country recently. Between March 2020 and February 2021, more than 3,700 hate incidents have been reported since the COVID-19 pandemic began, as shown. With Washington being the third state in America to have reported hate incidents, remember, this anti-Asian hate did not start at the beginning of the pandemic, but has been an ongoing problem since the 1800s. For too long, Asian and Pacific Islanders have been forgotten, erased, silenced, and gaslit. It is our time to be seen and to be heard. Grace Lee Boggs, a Chinese-American activist, once said, "History is not of the past. It is the stories we tell about the past. How we tell these stories, triumphantly or self-critically, metaphysically or dialectically, has a lot to do with whether we cut short or advance our evolution as human beings." The importance of storytelling can make a huge impact on our community by creating understanding and empathy, which leads to change. We are the product of our ancestors getting together and deciding that these stories need to be heard and told throughout our generation. As you watch these clips, please be respectful to your teachers, your peers, and guests we have featured in this film. And please give your full attention this morning. I know it's Wednesday morning and you're probably tired or in bed, but please mind that a lot of your students and friends have taken a lot of time to make this video for you to watch. Thank you so much for being here today. I hope you enjoyed this video. And of course, happy Heritage Month. Thank you.
I'm Leland Swartz.
Kylie Ding.
Jed Zoots. Emmett Donnelly.
It's Mario.
Lori Takahashi.
Gabe. Mr. Kuhn.
It's Helena Ghost.
I'm Jasmine.
Atsuko Yamaguchi.
Hamstar Haney.
It's Makila Siobhan Stewart Monroe.
Jamie Lee.
I'm Olivia.
Tiffany Robinson.
Joanne. I am actually half Vietnamese, but was adopted by a Japanese woman. And so I gravitate toward that ethnic group because of my mom and my upbringing. My mom was born in San Francisco in 1937 and lived there until they were incarcerated in World War II. So her family was taken to Heart Mountain, Wyoming, an internment camp. My uncle, he answered a questionnaire, a famous questionnaire, and answered two of the questions, no and no. And so he was called a no-no boy. and therefore, because he didn't say he had allegiance to America, even though he's incarcerated, he was taken to a separate camp because he was even more of an enemy to the United States, and so their family was separated. So my grandfather, Ojichan, he lost everything, like his place to live, his dry cleaning business was wiped out. And so not only did they lose their home and their honor, really, the honor is a huge thing in Japanese culture. They were finally released. They were not encouraged to go to the West Coast. A lot of families that did go to the West Coast encountered intense racism, even if they came back. My grandfather, when I talked to him about it, he never would answer me about the internment. My grandmother, Obachan, she never talked about it either. There was intense shame associated with what happened with World War II, and in that culture, they just didn't talk about it.
My parents and their parents, they were in the internment camps during World War II, and that had a really profound impact on them and how they choose to relate to society. And we picked up more of a don't cause trouble, keep a low profile, that kind of thing. It's easier for me to speak up than certainly like my parents or their parents certainly would. Yeah, although my dad's a little bit of a rebel, so maybe I should. He was always a bit of a rebel. He says to me, which I think is really interesting, he says, I didn't experience a lot of prejudice, when he certainly did. He did. And I think that's a way of covering up or saying, of not causing trouble, is by not admitting that there's a problem.
Because of my mixed nationalities, I come from lots of different communities that are thriving. I think because of this month, which is API month, we're gonna specifically talk about my Hawaiian heritage. And so my Hawaiian heritage comes from my mother's side of the family. My mother's grandmother was fully Hawaiian, so I don't have that much in me, but I definitely still love my Hawaiian heritage, my Hawaiian people. What I do know is there are a lot of people that are in intergenerational homes, and so I love going back to talk to my older aunties and great aunties and older cousins and second and third cousins. There's a lot of history, a lot of wisdom from them. One of the things that I really have enjoyed over the years is story time. Sitting down at the feet of aunties or cousins, older 70, 80, 90 years old, and them just telling us stories of their past, just knowing kind of the cultural background of those things and being able to pass them down to my children and nieces and nephews so that it doesn't pass away with the older aunties. So I think that that's really important as well.
Sisters getting together and saying these stories need to be told.
Absolutely.
And
most of them are not written down, which is
exactly.
really important. And so story time, I think, is really important because you have to hear these. You have to hear them, and a lot of times you have to hear them more than once so that you can totally get what they're saying and then be able to recite them and pass them down to future generations. So
we don't have recipes written down. You just have to learn by watching
Absolutely.
your mom cook it and then by tasting it and
Right.
everything.
Very similar, very similar. And actually, I have a niece who lives in North Carolina, and she calls me all the time about different recipes. And Auntie, how do you cook this? And I'm like, girl, because I can't tell her a cup of soy sauce or a cup of sugar. I'm like, Tiara, you're just gonna have to taste this. You know what it's supposed to taste like, so you're just gonna have to taste this. And she'll call and say, this doesn't taste like yours. Okay, what did you put in? How much did you put? Because I kind of know, somewhat. An aunt of mine some years ago made a apple pie. I promise to this day, probably still the best apple pie that I've ever eaten. And I cannot recreate that recipe for anything in the world. I do remember calling her being super frustrated. Like, you told me just put some sugar and, butter and whatever. And I was like, you used your hand when she... literally from the sugar bowl, she put sugar in her hand and put it in the bowl to make the apple pie. just taking the time, going to Auntie's house to figure out, okay, just a pinch. When she says a pinch of salt, she really does mean a pinch of salt. So just that kind of thing. So it's been interesting.
My mom makes fried rice. I like to make fried rice, and I made some this weekend. And I've like kind of slowly borrowed from all sorts of different families. I've learned from my mom. I learned the technique, but I've been eating fried rice my whole life, and not just from my own family. I'm also like learning from my community as like a whole, and like internalizing it and putting it inside of me, and creating something new from it.
What makes you proud to be an Asian student or person?
The food, for one. The food.
Yeah, the food.
I've really gotten to know the CID so much more, and I think, you know, for me, a lot of it has to do with food, because, you know, that's a lot of what we like to do, is to eat. And I think what was really unique about the CID for me was that the food was so familiar to me to what my parents would cook, and I couldn't get that like at the dorm. Now I know how to cook it, but I didn't know how to cook it at the time. And so that was like, it was like everything came back full circle for me, where like I thought it was something that like you could only do with your family. Like, oh, there's a community, but then the food reminded me of home again, and so it was like this like. So anyway, so that's my cultural background.
Well, basically, we don't celebrate holidays or anything like. We don't celebrate American holidays like that. We have our own. Basically, the only holidays we celebrate is Eid, and that only happens twice a year, and then we have Ramadan, which was a holy month of fasting.
You got school's day off for like Eden, etc.
Okay, well, basically, since I made a club, me and my other friends made a club, MSA. We're trying to get a day off for Eid in Seattle schools. Honestly, I feel like our school, like, they do a good job sometimes of representing us, but at the same time, like, there could always be more.
I think the first thing that comes to mind there is kind of just like representation. I feel like Asian people, like, we're often like talked about, but we're never represented like in positions of power. Like, I don't know, it's kind of like the model minority myth type of thing, where it's like, sure, we like, I don't know, like with employment, we have jobs, but very few of them are in positions of power or high up. And I think that's just an issue for me. That's kind of always bothered me. It's just like, my mom's been working at just one organization for years, but she's never been able to climb super high up. And I don't know if it's because she's Asian or anything, but it's just like other people, she complains about how other people started working after her, past her, and yeah, I don't know.
Representation, like Emmett said, we're seeing more people in more positions of power and more in the media in ways that aren't stereotypical and don't perpetuate any kind of like harmful message that we are used to receiving.
But because there are so few Asian people, specifically Vietnamese people as well, I work with people across the state and oftentimes across the country because they identify with you, right? There's not enough representation. So I'll have communities of color, I'll have Asian people, I'll have whatever, talk to me about their issues, and specifically me, because they don't trust other folks that are there. You know, it's one of those things where I honor and respect the heritage and the traditions of where we come from and the people who got us to this point, because truly a lot of sacrifices were made on my behalf. But at the same time, when you don't have the luxury of a narrative, when you don't see yourself in leadership, when you don't see yourself in media, it becomes very detrimental to your own self-worth. The weird part that I've seen in politics has been, you know, you hear people say, we need more young people, we need more people of color, we need more diversity in the legislature or whatever leadership position. And then when the person shows up, it's like, well, you need to wait your turn. We want more diversity, but not right now, only when it's convenient for us. So I was just like, no, just not, I'm not, like, that's just not me. I'm not gonna wait, right? Because like our communities need help right now. So I ran for office and won. And then what's funny is that when I won, people said, oh, he's not gonna be able to hit the ground running because he doesn't have a political background. And then I actually did fine. I helped negotiate the budget the first year. I passed some pretty significant pieces of legislation, including vacating marijuana convictions because our criminal justice system is broken. I'm like, okay, that seems fine, right? And then now it's like, oh, he only was able to be successful because it was a blue wave and like because we let him be there, right? So it's like it's such a weird dynamic being a young person of color, and specifically an Asian person as well, just because there's so few of us, where you're told the entire time you can't be there. When you get there, you're told you're not going to do well. You do well, and then when you do well, you're like, oh, it's not because of you. So it's like this weird dynamic that you have to operate in.
I grew up in Hawaii, a really cultural melting pot, like genuinely a cultural melting pot. And so most Asian people were brought to Hawaii via the sugarcane plantations. And so they were mostly indentured servants, which means you come over on a debt and then you work and pay off your debt and then you're free to go. And so, a large part of Hawaii's culture is still strongly based on the Asian community, and it's remarkable to just see how strong the culture of, the different Asian races are so deeply rooted and so intertwined, but still very much there. And so I think that's just a testament of how important our culture is to us. Like, we hold on to it for dear life and figure out ways to integrate it and keep it alive and keep it a part of our everyday. The slang language in Hawaii is Pidgin, and so you can hear all facets of, like, whether it be Hawaiian, you hear Portuguese in there sometimes, you hear Chinese, Japanese, you just hear like all these random languages just thrown in here and there, and even just kind of like the structure of the sentences is like super deeply rooted in like the Asian language and how sentences are set up there.
Like, as someone who's like third generation Asian American, and like my family, we don't speak any more Chinese. It's all gone. And unfortunately, like, it passed away with my grandparents, and so I guess a cultural thing I want to reclaim, like myself, is just how to speak Cantonese. And it's a super difficult language to learn. And especially when you don't have a family member or a teacher to teach you, like, or a family member as teacher to teach you. And so it's gonna be a lot of work, and but I guess that's the exciting part, is to sit down and do that work.
Before I moved to Seattle, I knew basically nothing about my culture, my background, my language, or anything like that. And I went to UW, and I got involved in the Bengali club that was there. And I took Bengali, which is my language and also the culture from India. And I started to learn more about like what my life would have looked like if I was still living in India.
The way we keep our culture like in place is my mom really likes to talk, just likes to speak to us in Tagalog because she doesn't want us to lose it. Because every time we go back to Philippines, she doesn't want it to be like awkward where we don't understand or we don't even speak it. So she likes to keep it within us because she just likes, I like it too personally, because like I like having another language, especially when I'm out somewhere and I want to talk to my mom personally. Like having that language, it's kind of like a power, because it's like I can say whatever I want and people won't understand me, especially if I'm here. Like I can talk and I can say anything I want, honestly, and it just feels cool because you can't do that anywhere else. And then when you do meet like other people and they can hear you, you're like, oh, you understand? And I don't know, it's just like it's really cool because like when I go, for example, like to South Center, I like going there. And there's like a lot of Filipinos there. And then like if they see me, like, okay, for South Center, if they see me and I'm talking, they're like surprised that I can speak. And then we just like get along so well. Like it's really cool. I like talking to fellow Filipinos.
Part of me really regrets not knowing Japanese, but at the same time, I didn't want to be, when I was a kid, I did not want to put an emphasis on my Asianness when I was a kid, because then that would get me noticed and teased or whatever, because certainly experienced a lot of prejudice when I was growing up, and still do.
So my experience as an immigrant is first generation immigrant is we always have accent. So therefore you don't people don't see me as a American. I saw there is a studies proving that people who has accent is mistreated, seen as uneducated and inferior people, and then not American. Because of my accent, I feel like maybe people don't see me as a American, right? Even though I'm a citizen here. One time we have a teachers meeting, small group meeting, and then we have I joined something like a racial kind of a race and
racial equity
kind of a team, and so we were discussing privilege and other issues, and then I talked about my experiences in United States, and one person said really politely, "Have you ever thought about going back to your country?"
You said that?
Yeah.
Oh
so
gosh.
I was
Like, weird.
really surprised to hear that this person is an educator.
How did that make you like feel? Were you like, oh?
Well, I thought, okay, we were talking about racial equity here. I'm not sure why this person is asking the really polite way to say things like that, but actually saying, if you don't like it, go back to your country, right? So kind of surprised to hear that, because especially we were emphasizing on those issues. So maybe at the time, maybe I thought, oh, okay, I am not American, foreigner kind of a feeling. Yeah.
In terms for me, like how I want to make sure my culture survives through my children is their names. I mean, that was like the biggest one, you know, so now my children are a quarter Japanese, and I'm super fearful that they won't be able to identify with that because, you know, physically they don't present that way. And so my daughter, I made sure her first name was Japanese so that she could always know, and if anybody ever asks, that's the first thing she says. It's like, oh yeah, my name is Japanese, so it's a constant reminder. And then my son, though he doesn't have a Japanese first name, he has a middle name that is our surname for our family, and so making sure that at the very least, right, like a constant reminder through their name that, you know, they are Japanese, and that is something that's super important to me and should be super important to them.
Some students, especially like Asian names, have to change to English names to make it easier for other people.
Yep, and I just think that's so sad. And it's interesting because my grandfather actually, when he started school, you know, he had to change his name. And they told him, he was 5 years old, kindergarten, and they asked him, oh, well, you need to change your Japanese name, what do you want? And so his name that he has gone by for the rest of his life, he actually chose himself, which I think is so fascinating. His name, he goes by Stanley. And so it's like I always just think that a 5-year-old boy saying, I want my name to be Stanley, which is, it's really funny, but it's sad in that way, right? Like, to that pressure that was put on him. And so, like, I feel like me giving my daughter, like I always get, me giving my daughter a Japanese name and her being able to honor her family and say, and have no one tell her, like, you have to change your name, or, you know, like, I tell her, say your name correctly and demand other people say it correctly. And that's what it is.
My government given name is Lani Kayla, and my name is Hawaiian. I rarely go by Lani Kayla. It's my family name, so that's what my family calls me. But even Makila, like, people butcher it, and I go, and I've gotten to a point now to where I do correct people, but there was a long stint of time where I didn't correct people, just because it was easier to not correct them. But now, I don't know if that's the lack of acceptance of people butchering my name, but I correct them every time now. So I tell people all the time, think of tequila with an M. That's how you say my first name. It's just kind of that whole cultural appropriation. I don't want to do that anymore. So I want you to say my name correct. And so even, my students who, when I see on paper, like, ooh, I don't know how to say that. So I'll ask them, how do you say your name? And they'll tell me, and I'll try it. And if I butcher it, I'm like, no, tell me again. Let me say it right. So I don't want to mess people's names up. That's important to me, because that's personal. A lot of times people were named by someone else, and it might be a family name or a traditional name. And I want them to know, I want my students to know, I want family to know. That's important. So I respect your culture. I respect, your family, and I respect you as a person. I respect your name. So I'm heavily into music. My Auntie Mary passed away a few weeks ago, and her funeral was a long week process, and ended with a Friday and Saturday. Sang all night long, told stories. We did like testimony and things that you would say like nice about somebody. And then we sang in English, we sang in Samoan, we sang in Hawaiian, but just, and all the little kids. There were kids as small as like 2 months old and as old as like 98. And so just singing these songs, call and response, it was beautiful. It was beautiful. It was emotional.
My community is thriving because it's changing from generation to generation. The younger generations are learning from the generations before it, and we're like continuing to adapt and grow the food and culture to like our own generational like needs. What's that word?
New traditions?
Traditions!
Oh,
That's the word I'm looking for. That's exactly it. Creating new traditions to pass down. Not even down like that, like to my children, but also to the community around me. That we can all share in it and all be stronger for it.
I still hold those things with me. My family story, as I walk and see justice and injustice, those things are still with me, and I certainly identify those things when I see them.
The community is really strong. Like, I only recently got involved with it because I'm adopted. I was raised by a lot of white people and only white people. But it's welcoming and really supportive.
Being mixed, it's been a really weird experience for me, just because like I don't really know where I fit, but like I've been going to the Tet Festival, the Lunar New Year Festival in Seattle Center for years, and basically every year, the last year. But that's always been a time where it's like, I know like, oh, I am Asian. I am part of this. I can experience this, and it's just nice to be like, feel like you're part of like a culture, part of something else. Yeah.
I think some of the things that are interesting are how parts of the culture has become more mainstream. So like, I remember seeing like Slumdog Millionaire, which gave a broader view of that. There's holidays like Diwali, which are more commonplace now, or there's like even runs that people do that mimic some of the traditions from India. And so in that way, the culture is not only surviving, but kind of rippling out and becoming more mainstream.
Do you like that it's becoming like more mainstream?
I think definitely you've got to be careful about cultural appropriation. But I think that the more we learn about other people's cultures, the more we can, love what makes each culture unique and special.
I like being Filipino, especially because I was born there and I know a lot of my culture there. And like, I'm proud of it because it's a fun place to be in. And like, seeing people here with like the same culture as me is really important because it feels like I'm home.
If you could tell your younger self something, what would it be?
It's not that you don't have a place in this country or in this world, or that you weren't deserving of love just because you're Asian. It's just the area you grew up in.
Probably that you can identify with multiple things. There's not one trait that defines anyone. So you're Asian, you're Asian, you're white, you're many things, and you should be proud of all of it. Yeah.
is your message for young leaders, specifically those in the AAPI community?
You are more powerful than you think you are, right? Like oftentimes we're told that we can't do something because of whatever. You're not in the right political group, you don't have the right funding, you don't have the right sources and all that stuff. It's not true. You're actually more powerful than you think you are, and your lived experiences inform your decision making. And I think oftentimes in the Asian community, we've not really reached out into these types of leadership roles in the past because it wasn't really presented to us. So for those in the AAPI community, I really do believe that your voice is worthy of being heard, and making sure that you uplift and amplify each other while you do it. Because as a community, we've shown ourselves to be very resilient and very strong. And I think it is fair for us to want to be in leadership as well. So that's probably what I would say is, like, you know, growing up, I was told to literally just sit down and be quiet. And I just wish I hadn't done that. And I wish I had been more vocal, even as more than I was, you know, as a kid, and being able to get more involved as well, is because I think that there is a dire need in our communities to have leadership that reflects our values. And we're seeing it manifest again, like I said, in the anti-Asian hate, is because we've been minimized for so long. So now more than ever, it's important to make sure that our voices are being heard.
I'd like to thank CAPS for the opportunity to read. And this poem was originally written for a street dedication ceremony in October 2020. Home at last. Welcome friends, welcome family, welcome teachers and students, lovers and lost. Let me tell you a story, sad and true. Before that Bank of America on 28th was built, before its American flag colors glowed softly in the night, the land was farmed by husband and wife, wife and husband. They were called, by those who knew them and those who didn't, Shizuo and Yaiko Hayashi. They farmed their land and sold their produce by their little company, Lake City Farms. Planting seeds, harvesting fruits, they loved their community and tended it as they did their crops, with love and time and work, and even gave trees to the first public lands in the neighborhood. Their life was good. Their oak tree's roots held firm. Cue December 7th, 1941, a little after 8 a.m. Cue the hate, the hostility, the hysteria. Cue the slurs on neighborhood walks and business hours. Cue February 19th, 1941, Executive Order 9066. The following instructions must be observed. A responsible member of the family, preferably the head of a family or the person in whose name most property is held, will report to the Civil Control Station to receive further instructions. And so, like any good members of society, read victims of racism, read blamed for the crimes of another country, read fearful for the safety of their family, the Hayashis complied. They packed their bedding and linens, no mattresses, for each member of the family. Toilet articles for each member of the family. Extra clothing for each member of the family. Sufficient knives, forks, spoons, plates, bowls, and cups for each member of the family. Essential personal effects for each member of the family. They made sure all items were securely packaged, tied plainly and marked with the name Hayashi. They made sure all items could be carried by the family. Then they boarded a bus. They left their farm. They left their home for Camp Harmony and never returned. Even the roots of a mighty oak tree can only hold so long. Until now. Now the saplings that sprung from the roots are stretching their way up, beginning to recall the tree that they came from, reminding us of the tree that they came from. So now we will rename. We will remember the tree. We will remember the name. And the oak tree shall live on, and it will be as if it were never gone.
Take my hand and don't let go. I'm addicted to your loving. But if you should know how my love goes, But if you should know how my love flows, then baby stay close. You won't ever have to cry, no, no. So wipe them tears from your eyes. As long as you're by my side, you won't shed no tears, 'cause everything will be just